very excited about this conversation to engage together about career pathways and what it takes to actually move people into careers and up within careers over time. I am particularly excited about this in a number of dimensions. When I think about what that takes to actually ensure that people have success and achieve mobility in their careers, one of the things that we've learned is that, first of all, people can achieve that mobility. It sounds like an ideal, and that may sound obvious, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves of. Some research that we've done recently showed that almost 50% of opportunity youth actually are able to move up into careers that pay significantly more, that give them a living wage, that give them a chance at real success. We also know that the ways that turn out to be most successful are not the ones that insist that people leap tall buildings in a single bound, but that move people up step by step. There's an assumption that people starting off in their careers, that first move is everything, and if you make the right first move, you move up into your career. If you don't, you don't. But that's sort of like thinking in a game of chess that the first move determines the game. It's important how you start, but the middle of the game determines much more. So I always love the fact that this is not only a discussion about pathways, but that it's framed about the notion of liquidity. In a market, liquidity means that there is enough supply and demand, that there is enough in the world of people's careers, both opportunity and skill. Well, we know there's enough opportunity. And so the question is, how can people acquire that skill over time? And so excited to be joined by a fabulous group of panelists today. Angela Dunckelman from Google.org, Rebecca Tabor from Merit America, Philomena from Grand Valley State University, and Jonathan Stull from Handshake. And looking forward to diving right in and encourage you to read about the excellent work that they're all doing in the app. Rebecca, let's start with you if you don't mind.
I thought I said no cold calls.
The sky deck. So, Rebecca, what's the scope of this problem? We tend to think about this around students in school, around traditional students, but I know from the work that you're doing at Merit that you guys are thinking about this as a much bigger problem. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I think about the problem, I actually don't go to the huge scale of it, but the individuals who are really touched by it. So to paint the picture of an individual, imagine that you are 33 years old, you dropped out of college 14 years ago, you still have about $15,000 in debt from your first year in college. You work full-time as a driver for Uber, in retail, in food service, or other gig economy jobs. You have kids, you have debt, $25,000 a year in salary, and no upward mobility in your job. So if that's you, what would you do? Actually, can people just quickly shout out and then we'll move on? What would you do? What would you do?
Community college.
Community college? Okay, you're working full-time and you have debt.
Go 1 night a week or Saturday.
1 night a week or Saturday. It's going to take you about 8 years, but that could work. Anyone else? Take an ASU online course, again, probably 6 to 8 years. But I think what's important is this is the most knowledgeable group in the country of what you should do. And we don't have a clear answer. We don't have a clear answer for the 100 million people who are in low-wage jobs or in between jobs in the workforce, who don't have college degrees, who are making $30,000 on average in jobs at huge risk of automation for where they go. And so the last bit of the problem is we hear from our folks that they can't go back to school, they already have too much debt, they don't have the time, they can't work their way up in the jobs they're in now because we've got a really bifurcated economy and there's no clear path from Uber driver to Uber corporate. They can't do a coding boot camp or a full-time training program because they have to work full-time and they don't have the means to afford it. And they've tried online courses, but they don't know what to take, can't get through it alone, and can't connect it to a job. So that's the problem we're trying to solve.
You know, that really accords with some of what we know about the market as well. We've done a lot of work looking at what's the relationship between jobs. And often, the great thing about this is that opportunity is often a lot closer than people think. To your point, the community college degree or whatever it may be requires a lot of learning. A couple of skills can sometimes really actuate people in their careers and move them up to jobs that are much lower automation risk or the like. So we agree that there's a huge scale of problem, a huge scale of opportunity. How do you take the wonderful experiments that exist out there today and actually scale them up?
Is that for me again?
Yeah.
All right. Well, when we think about that population and the scale of the problem, we know that there are 4 things they really need. They need programs that are focused on in-demand careers. So not something that's going to get them a credential and who knows where it's going to go, but it's actually tied to a job that exists today. The second thing they need is it needs to be fast so they can have success in months, not years. This is a group, over 2/3 of our population at Merit America has already tried college and been failed by the system, and they're really skeptical of huge investments in time just to try to get a credential that may or may not go somewhere. It needs to be flexible so they can do it while they work, because right now with unemployment being so low, we have people who are underemployed, not unemployed. And it needs to be financed based on success so that they don't have to pay a dime unless they have an outcome. So those 4 things are what we know they need. And I think when we think of our model specifically, what we've seen success in trying to build something capable of scale is really being thoughtful of how you combine technology and everything it does in terms of access with the support needed to actually make the most of technology. So we say we take online learning and we turn it into a team sport. I used to work at Coursera, and the content is incredible. The Google IT cert is incredible. It's everything you need to get from nothing to an upwardly mobile career, but people need to know what to take, they need help getting through it, and they need to connect it to the job. So we provide those wraparound supports, but do it in a way that's capable of scale, so we can reach tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people versus the traditional nonprofit that might only reach a couple hundred people a year.
And Rebecca, one last one for you on this. You're, sorry to pick on you. But fascinating what you're doing.
Not that sorry.
And you talked about kind of this skepticism that learners sometimes bring to this because the system has often failed them. What's the quick evidence that you can provide them that not only upfront but over time that they continue to see that this is worth continuing to invest in?
Well, I think the skepticism is actually really important for all of us to acknowledge, because even though we know that the higher ed system is failing low-income students across the board, when they show up at Merit America, they really own that as a personal failure, that they started college, that's what they were supposed to do, and they dropped out. And it was largely for non-academic reasons. It was too expensive, they got pregnant, someone in their family got sick, but they're carrying a lot of that individual shame for a system-wide problem. So we try to rework that mindset right away. But the results that we tell them about, and what I think has us having way more applicants than we know what to do with right now, is that in under 6 months, you can, without quitting your day job, get skills for an in-demand career, get credit towards a degree if that's what you want to choose to do and to continue, and most importantly, get into a new job where you're making, right now we're seeing an average wage gain of $17,000 for folks who are in 25K jobs without having to pay a dime or give up an opportunity cost of wages. So a short intervention where, Matt, I think as you always said, we're breaking down those smaller steps. So we're not a coding boot camp taking people from 0 to 100,000 overnight, but we're saying how do we help the millions of people who are in the workforce who don't have many years to make that big a jump go from 25K in a dead-end job to 45K in an upwardly mobile career.
Philly, I'd like to turn to you if I may.
Sure.
You've done so much both at Northeastern in crafting a strategy oriented toward serving people in the workplace and preparing people for the workplace. You've now taken on the challenge of leadership of Grand Valley. Traditional higher ed doesn't really fit the kind of model that Rebecca was just describing. Isn't necessarily oriented around pathways either in or up for people who are already in the workplace. How are you changing that?
So I started my career in enrollment management, and I think in some ways it was trying to predict 17-year-old behavior. So you got to be insane to want to do that. And then moved into student affairs, which was trying to control 18-year-old behavior. And then into sort of change and innovation in higher education with leading what was really an accelerator at Northeastern University to move the institution. And Northeastern, as you've identified in this room, is an institution because of its experiential model integrated with work and learning, because of its 120 years in various forms of that model. There's really quite open to moving to the kinds of challenges that you describe. But even in that environment, couldn't move with the market and at the scale and at the pace that was required. And so I went from, that journey to now trying to move an institution towards these new models. So I don't know, I think all three of those might qualify as insanity. I'm not really sure. As a university, at Grand Valley State, I think, part of it is really being willing to confront some of the questions that are out there and some of the rhetoric that we put out there ourselves, like the relationships that are required to support students in the journey, the online content that you mentioned can be high quality, but the supports, the scaffolding, the structures also needed there can only be formed in classrooms of under 20 students or between a tenured faculty member in an environment of X. And so I think it's getting to the essence of the issue, and that's about relationships and inclusion and inclusive prosperity, and not about sort of buying into the norms of how we apply that in the old model, because that's what we've got to challenge in the new model. We've got to challenge ourselves and being out front. And one of the things in taking on a presidency late in your career is you can be very authentic about what you think and what you think we have to achieve, and see if the institution will move with you. And I actually don't think that, I think there's a lot of institutions that will have significant challenge in sort of grasping this as a really exciting opportunity. I don't even say making the transition. Andrew Rosen said it earlier, really very well, is grasping it. And I really looked hard for an institution that had that kind of mindset around learning is central, not education, but learning is central. That the mission, we could really focus on the mission and then translate it in different mediums and modes. And then call the institution to pace and progress at a pace that is not academic time, but is market time. And that you're sitting up here with a president of 6 months, so the jury is still out on the ability to affect that change. I think we did make great traction at Northeastern by being able to really challenge those norms, put some models and experiments out there that people could gravitate towards and learn from, and then figure out how to turn those experiments into scale. And I think that's what it's going to take.
So Philly, let me ask you, just to get a level more specific, when you think about so much of the definition of the kind of pathways we're trying to affect as being about working learners, what does an institution look like in a world of working learners? How does it change the design of the institution? What needs to change in the system itself in order for higher education to serve the much bigger market of people who are out in their careers?
Yeah, I think the academic content in the purest form, if you have an analytics curriculum, is fairly constant. It's the relationship between that and what the person knows. So the first thing is having a regard for what someone is bringing to the table with 20 or 30 years or 10 years or 5 years of experience, and understanding how that requires a calibration and how that curriculum applies to me. So that's kind of number one. I think the design of the support, and I think you said it very well. I think they've got to be fast-tracked activity that has the face-to-face support and individual touches in the exact right points, and allows people to move through with, I personally think, concentration on one area that can be applied to what they're doing in an immersive fashion to the next area, but the pace is quick. So I think it's in the design, I think it's in the modality, I think it's in the supports. And you know what? And I say this to the faculty, it is not a deficit model. We're an institution that is largely been about traditional age students. And I think we can't say, well, adult learners are okay. It's okay that they don't have X or Y. We gotta love those adult learners. We gotta love what they bring to our institutions. And we gotta be ready to say, this is an additive population, not a deficit population.
I think that's such an important point. The notion that this is not only additive to the institution, but it's also additive to the mission of the university. We're in a time when institutions are struggling on enrollment, institutions are struggling with high costs, and this is the much bigger market. It's also, as we've been talking about, a much bigger opportunity for the world of learners themselves. And so, of course, this happens within people's careers, and that's where learning takes place. Andrew, that takes me to you. On panels like this, the notion of reskilling and upskilling and the kind of opportunity that this opens up for people is so powerful that this just feels like a total no-brainer. And yet, there just aren't that many employers who are getting on the bus. What's stopping them?
Well, I think we need better data on this question. The last data that I've seen stops in 2008 about employer investment in training. It certainly seems, anecdotally to me at least, that a lot of big employers, and we've heard some examples this morning, have stepped up and started to really invest in tuition benefits, unique programs like Guild Education. I think Walmart's been really leading the way on this. And at Google, certainly, we've made over $1 billion investment over the last 5 years in Grow with Google through things like our IT support certificate to help people ladder into careers in the digital economy. So I'm not totally convinced that we have not seen employers stepping up to the table. But again, we need good data on this question. I do think that there are big market dysfunctions in how employers can do this most effectively. And so we talked about liquidity earlier. You know, sitting in a big employer, I often get frustrated by how often I hear things like, employers don't want a seat at the table, or they're not telling us what skills are needed, when in practice, the folks that I talk to all the time really want to have that discussion, but don't know where to turn. There's massive fragmentation in the educational provider landscape. The cycle time, to use language that Philly, you used earlier, the market time and the academic time are two totally different timelines. And so through our IT support certificate, which we've partnered with Becca on, we've done 2 massive rewrites in the curricula in the year and a half that's been out already. Now imagine trying to secure some kind of credit articulation for that in an educational institution. That's pretty tough. So certainly agree with the call. More employers need to be stepping up. Would love to see more data about who is stepping up, but I also think there are some fundamental market discrepancies that make it really hard to do this kind of thing at scale.
So when I think about certification programs like you've been building, I often think about the signal power that they have. And that signal is not only to employers, but it's also a signal to workers and learners themselves of where opportunity lives. But those things tend to live right now fairly isolated forms. It's easy to sort of think about a signal processing problem in the market. There's millions of signals being sent every day by employers, but what they need, people are sending millions of resumes every day. They're signaling what skills they have. How do people read these signals? You guys own Waze. Where's the Waze app for people's careers?
You know, our mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible. I think this is some of the most difficult information we've ever tried to organize, honestly. We've got a few things that we're doing. So we've got a program called Pathways, which is a new feature in search designed to help people discover sub-degree, certificate, industry credential, apprenticeship, and other programs to ladder them into entry-level career opportunities. We've been at this for 6 months, and right now it's only available in 2 MSAs, which are Richmond and Norfolk, Virginia. And the reason for that has been a structured data problem, which is that when we try to work with communities and states and unlock the data that's needed to help users make informed decisions about what entry career programs are going to turn into earning, and we heard this discussion a lot this morning, but at the end of the day, when users turn to Google and they don't know what job they want, most folks, I would posit, are looking for what's going to put some dollars in their bank account. And so if we are unable to tell people which of these programs is going to result in them making a living, then we're not doing our service in helping users deliver on their intent when they're entering Google search. So we've been through Google.org investing in a number of the initiatives that many of you are involved in, T3 Innovation Network, the US Chamber of Commerce Works, the Credential Engine, and many others to try to bring some standardization to the data so that we can deliver that. But I do think more than anything, there's a data problem that we have to address before we can start to help people make informed decisions.
There may be a language problem as well. I've heard you say that when we talk about reskilling, we're making this all sound really scary. Is that lack of transparency part of what you mean there?
Well, when I talk about reskilling publicly, one of my great frustrations is that people in the education system, like people in this room, get excited about that. We like this kind of stuff. We like to talk about it. And so we get starry-eyed when we talk about reskilling. For most people who are working individuals, the idea that they have to go and pursue another college degree, particularly if maybe they weren't successful the first time around or didn't really like it, is, I think, really daunting. And so I'd like to remind people that for most of us, the acquisition and application of skills in our careers happens in an ongoing way. 1 billion people turn to YouTube every day for learning content. And most of us are picking up micro skills that we don't credential, we don't understand how they have education market value, and we call that reskilling. So I think we have to reconsider the way we talk about reskilling as industry professionals so that we can do a better job of really solving the problem that we mean to solve.
Yeah, indeed. Jonathan, I want to come to you. We've been talking a lot about how we help evidence the kind of careers and create the kind of structures of learning that get people in, that get people moving, that get people learning. Handshake has done so much important work in helping make sure that people achieve success through their education, not just in the education, but specifically in placing into careers. But the way that most of career support happens within universities is really oriented today around, again, traditional students. How does that change, and how do you guys change in a world where there's a more fluid dynamic between careers and work?
That's a great question. Well, I think in general this has been really fascinating. I think just to touch on a couple other points too, I think it's been the area that we're focused on, and I come from this lens, is really that bridge between education or skilling in general and employment. And so I think the points that Andrew and others have made around this, the fragmentation from the employer lens of this, we have 450,000 employers using Handshake. We deal with 900 institutions, Grand Valley one among those. And those employers generally, they don't want to navigate and figure out what those buckets of talent are. They just want to find great people. And so sometimes it's a university, but increasingly it's places like Merit America and others where, but from an employer lens, unless they've heard about it or been introduced, it's often overwhelming. And so to the points we have earlier, a lot of what we're focusing on is how do you have that bridge layer that does try to normalize and standardize words. We do it already with majors. That sounds really basic, but 900 universities call the same thing 900 different names. And so alone, we've had to build that taxonomy, and that's something we're looking forward for skills, because that is, I think, the biggest inefficiency in this market, frankly, is that leads to a lack of connection, is the fact that employers are thinking about these terms in very different ways than often the institutions are, and certainly different than the students. And that then evolves very differently, to your point, as the nature of the student evolves. So today, the reality, though, is 25% of college, four-year college students are actually adults or often are parents as well. So we deal with that today, and that's a natural thing. But to your point, though, they usually engage with student services, particularly things like career services, in a very different way. That's partly why we are used by the career services, is because the historical model of a on-campus room where you went to and visited and got your advisory appointments is great if you can do that, but it's also great if you're Princeton, you have 145 students per every counselor. At, Grand Valley State, I know Northern Michigan, I think it's 2,500 students to one counselor. No matter what, you could have as many rooms as you want, you can't reach all those students. So a lot of what we do is we're doing things like reviews, Q&A tools, community groups, and messaging with alumni to try to help do that. But I think the challenge of doing that is that technology can only place even a small layer, even if you're communicating with individuals. And so the more I think we can work with a wide range of other, whether it be college institutions or things like Merit America, you need to combine the tech layer up top with really the personal touch. And I think the more you can have sort of experimental experiments, but certainly new ways of doing things that augment what the university is doing is really necessary.
I love the kind of change you're describing. In a lot of ways, when I think about the kind of ways that people search today, it tends to be almost sort of structured around being a buying site, right? You're out there, you're booking a hotel room, you're whatever it is that you're looking for. How do we help students find a job? How do you change that, both from a mindset, but also from a structure perspective, to making the transition from education to careers be about a selling site. How do you represent yourself, and how do you put forward the right set of signals to the market?
Great question. What's interesting is I think increasingly the converse of that, and I thought you were going to go too, is that employers are also, traditionally you would, to your point, you would sell, but they are really focusing on one of the reasons they're using Handshake is around branding and getting their name out there and what they do. Because even on the flip side of that is just students have no idea what most jobs are, most careers, let alone most employers. They've heard of Google, they've heard of Nike, they've heard of Starbucks, they've heard of consumer brands, and maybe they've heard of the top other company in investment banking, they've heard of Goldman Sachs, and then, but below that they're trying to figure it out. So every other employer, 449,000 of our employers are trying to sell themselves to students, vice versa. On the student side, your point, I think that's the biggest challenge they have is they don't, and Andrew, I think really eloquently, is that most people have a lot more skills than they can describe. They have no idea how to describe them. So the best career services that we're working with, when they do have those appointments, a lot of what they're trying to do is to help students describe the actual things they're learning in ways that the market can understand. And I know there's a ton of different work being done by nonprofits and others to try to normalize that and automatically translate a class into a skill. And the challenge we've seen there is it's also heavily fragmented, and there's tons of different people approaching that problem, leading to sort of more churn. And I think that's where we need the more we can figure out how to, at our level, help to standardize that, it's going to be impactful.
Fantastic. Well, I'm really looking forward to questions from the audience. I want to introduce the two people who will be leading us, who we're really lucky to have in facilitating this part of the conversation. Frank Britt at Penn Foster, which is working with hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, something like
Hundreds
that.
of thousands?
Hundreds of thousands. I thought there might be hundreds, but I was like, I didn't want to get that wrong. Of students in acquiring the kind of skills to get them into careers that really provide mobility. And also Bennin, who runs NewU Venture Partners, which is really about commercializing some of the most innovative models in connecting between education and careers, and they'll be leading us in these questions.
Thank you, Matt. My question for the group, and maybe as a catalyst for the rest of the audience here, Jonathan was just talking about last mile services and the need for innovation in last mile services. If they'll think about the larger conversation today, it's about improvement in outcomes. And for the non-traditional learner, it's often the first mile services that are actually the greater inhibitor than actually the learning itself. And while it's always better to have enhancements on the career services side, if you can't get through the program, it's not that primary. So I guess my question is, as we think about new brands and the reinvention of old brands or existing brands, do you see that the education institutions of the future are going to take much more focus on the first mile services in terms of food sustainability, mental health services, transportation, all the things that actually inhibit the non-traditional learner from actually getting the kind of outcomes they want, which leads to economic mobility?
I'll try that. I think that educational institutions are seeing the sort of first order, which I'm not defending as the right order, but the first order is the things more directly associated with learning, and are still ambivalent about how much support to lend in an area like mental health services, where the services are already under great pressure. And if we start to think about the complexity of life, the lifespan, the skills one would need within a center that was going to support them, I don't think we've begun to really touch your question in a substantial way. We're struggling with really the first set, which are those that are really more directly related to the learning journey. Daycare you might put in that, financial support, advising, peer-to-peer models, all of those that support the learning. I think we have a variety of really good things going on, but that next level of activity, I think we don't have near as much as we probably should going on.
Just to add to that, I think sometimes education providers get overwhelmed in how can we solve all of these problems, so we'll solve none of them. When what we see is what our participants really need is someone to help them navigate, to help them get through the program and understand when they have a mental health issue, when they have a childcare issue, where can they look? And often we get criticized, well, that's not scalable. We can't give everyone a personalized coach. But at Merit America, we give one coach per every 90 learners a year, either 3 30-person cohorts or 2 45-person cohorts. It's a great touch ratio. And we pay those coaches $65,000 plus benefits, all in $90K. So our per learner coaching cost is under $1,000 a year. And when you think of the charges that go into a higher ed or other program right now, If we can't afford a couple $100s a year for the coaching that in our program makes the difference between 5% online completion rates and 90% online completion rates, between no wage gain and no graduation and doubling your salary and having a great outcome in 6 months, then I think we're spending our money in the wrong places.
So there's often a friction between employers, students, and learners and institutions. You guys have discussed here on this panel. We've heard the common term, common language between employers, students, and institution. Who do you think should be leading that effort? And what would an ideal model look like in terms of a Rosetta Stone that would really connect all three stakeholders, employers, institutions, and learners?
I can take a stab in the sense that I think, to be honest, and this is where Handshake sits, because there isn't a standard, we're going to start doing some of that ourselves. And so whether we should be or not, I think that's where we sit in the marketplaces. We've done that with some level of standardization across things, like I mentioned, majors. Every school will still continue to call whatever you want to call, but when an employer comes and they're looking for a student, we map that all together and try to normalize that in a way that's a common standard language. In the same way that you can have a lot of different credentials going out and be called different things, and skills potentially called multiple different things for different bodies and nonprofits, we're going to try to put a layer on top of that that provides some normalization and standardization. Not because I think I think it is very hard to enforce a common standard that everyone will buy into, because I've seen so many of these things going on. NACE, which is the National Association of Colleges and Employers, which is the career services org, has their competency standard. I've talked to multiple different nonprofits in DC who have those standards, and I just think the challenge of it is to get everyone to adopt one. And so our approach personally is going to be more that there's going to be multiple different people who have different ideas, and for Handshake to work as a marketplace, we're just going to put our layer on top, and if that's the one that is used beyond Handshake, fantastic. But if you're on Handshake, which most employers are today and most colleges are, that's the nomenclature we use. How we'll do that, we'll see as we go forward. We've done some of that, but that's we're going to do it on our own side just because I think it's necessary, and we can't wait around for someone to make that happen.
I would say it depends a little bit on what component of the problem you're talking about. So there's probably a different answer with regard to outcomes versus skills taxonomy versus, say, job description language. And so for each of those, there are a handful of individuals who are trying to organize this space, and happy to talk after about who we've worked with and partnered with. But taking a page from some of the other great data standards movements of the past, I would just say, and this is relatively obvious and boring, that it needs to be open, collaborative, and multi-sector. And I think some of the things that have popped up are starting to get there, but these are not fast processes, and so we need to engage a little bit with the messiness of what it means to build a standards movement.
I would also just add that, I think the more we port experience into the educational process, the more that there's an organic happening, because you've got students who are challenging what's happening in the workforce in the academic work. You've got faculty who are supportive and listening because they're connected with those employers who help them develop the curriculum. So I think experience embedded in the learning will start to create it on an individual frame as well as on a systemic frame, and both of those pieces of work obviously are important.
Temi, go ahead.
The title is about education to employment pathways, but I wonder about the reverse. What about employment to education? And it's been sort of latent in the panel's conversation about skills that are acquired in the workplace. So, for example, the IT support certificate or other industry certs, and then supporting learners who then want to stack that into further educational credentials. So I'm wondering if the panel could speak to that in some way in terms of how we make this a bidirectional liquidity versus this sort of traditional unidirectional throw it over the wall mentality.
Just a couple of off-the-cuff reflections. What I have heard from peer employers who are offering significant, say, tuition reimbursement assistance or other degree offerings, that there is substantially low uptake among their frontline workforce for those services. And I think there are a handful of reasons for that, but if I had to speculate, we still do a lousy job of explaining ROI and potential payoff. We haven't created the room within the workday to allow people to take advantage of those offerings. And so I think, Becca, you've experimented with some really interesting things about how to create flexible learning around worker time. Would love to hear more about that. And we haven't figured out how to create it in a sufficiently bite-sized way so that people aren't flummoxed by the size of the potential thing that they need to undertake. So I'm excited about some of the innovation for people in the room, for thinking about how we build that into the learning standards, but also from an employer perspective, we need to not be so ready to take off the shelf solutions and really figure out how we embed what's in the marketplace into the lived experience of, say, frontline workers. It's a complicated problem, but those are a few off-the-cuff thoughts.
And I think just to add to that, one of the coolest things is we now have alums who've been out of the program for about a year, people who had 15 years with no education whatsoever in the same dead-end jobs, and a year into being in a skilled career, they're coming to us and saying, are you offering the new IT Python certificate so that I can keep upskilling? So we've really rewired people from thinking about education as a place where their inputs did not lead to successful outcomes to, in a short period of time, I can see an immediate result in my own skill development and what employers acknowledge. So I think the two pieces of the equation there are getting education providers to create these faster, more flexible, tightly aligned programs, and getting employers to really have quick and immediate rewards for people who go through them.
Just one very specific example is Google created a program, our machine learning crash course, just about 2 years ago, which we encouraged all software engineers to go through a crash course in machine learning because, of course, the company is becoming an AI-first company. And it required a lot of sticks and not only carrots for our frontline managers to allow people to undertake that. Because if you're building a software product at Google, you know, it's hard to take time away to go and do a crash course. So we required leave time for engineers who wanted to go and take that program. We also created certain incentives related to leveling and so forth that would promote uptake. So there's like some very just tactical things that employers can do to promote uptake as well.
I think, Kemi, you've done some of the best work in this space with the blending of the sort of assets of the employer, whether that's an IBM badge or it's a GE's retiring workforce in manufacturing, into the assets of the academy to come up with a way to enrich both, or using the sort of work-based projects that are more relevant to the employers to make the work in education not so much an intersection but a blend. And I think those are the ways that we get the bidirectional activity.
I think we've got time for one last question.
I could ask one more question. This conversation has not included one important stakeholder, which is the government, which is the primary funding agent for higher ed, and obviously the Department of Labor with the WIOA Act. Do you see government playing a primary or increasingly secondary role in helping to enable the kind of changes you guys are talking about?
I think this whole area, if we were calling it the intersection between work and learning, lifelong learning, skills over a lifetime, has great potential for stakeholders to find wins in this, whether it's the government, state and federal, whether it is the institution for which they are going to be struggling with a demographic decline, or whether it's the individual. So I think a lot about your question in terms of what becomes the public policy catalyst to have everyone have skin in the game here: employers, individuals, institutions, providers. And I don't think we've explored that question quite enough, whether that is portability of benefits, loan forgiveness. At Grand Valley, we're trying something that's called a lifetime learner commitment, where we're creating a fund for people to return for reskilling who's gone through our undergraduate degree, and we're asking our philanthropic community, who's really supported the origin of the university, to step in. And it's caught some attention of the state policymakers, and now we're like, well, okay, that's nice that we have attention. We'd like to leverage each other's resource and opportunities. Like, how do we move there? But I think it's a really important question.
Thanks so much. I just want to thank all the panelists. It's been a fabulous conversation. Learning is a unique opportunity for people to arbitrage in themselves, to buy low and sell high. If you're an admin, you make $32,000 a year, and you add Salesforce skills, you make 40. That's buying low and selling high. Pathways are about giving people the transparency to see those opportunities, the efficiency to be able to acquire them quickly, and the efficacy to actually make the jump. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.